might be understood as a sacred offering, a depth of seeing, a quality of acceptance, a belief in the other person's potential that exists at a spiritual or soul level. The empath is operating, whether consciously or unconsciously, within what we might call a soul contract, an agreement to witness another person's wholeness, to hold space for their transformation, to love them not just for who they are, but for who they might become. This isn't naivete, though it's often mischaracterized that way. This is the empath bringing their deepest gifts to the relationship. They see beneath the narcissist's defenses to the wounded child, to the fragmented self, to the potential for healing and integration, and they offer something profound in response: unconditional positive regard, deep empathy, the willingness to stay present even when things are difficult. The empath treats this connection as sacred. They honor it with their full presence, their authentic vulnerability, their commitment to growth, both their own and their partners. They believe, often with spiritual conviction, that this relationship has meaning beyond the mundane, that they've come together for purposes of mutual evolution, that the challenges they face are opportunities for deepening rather than reasons to leave. But here's the devastating realization that arrives when the soul contract breaks. The narcissist was never operating within the same framework. What the empath offered as sacred, the narcissist received as transactional. What the empath understood as a spiritual partnership, the narcissist experienced as a supply arrangement. What the empath believed was mutual, this journey of growth and transformation, was actually one-sided. The empath was engaged in something holy, while the narcissist was engaged in something entirely different: extraction. Let me be clear about what I mean by this. The narcissist recognized the empath's gifts, their capacity for deep seeing, their willingness to hold space, their belief in potential, their unconditional acceptance. But they didn't receive these gifts as sacred offerings to be honored. They identified them as resources to be exploited. The empath's deep seeing became something to manipulate. The narcissist learned to perform vulnerability to activate the empath's compassion. The empath's unconditional acceptance became something to abuse. The narcissist learned they could behave badly, and the empath would find ways to understand and forgive. The empath's belief in the narcissist's potential became a tool for keeping the empath invested in a future that would never arrive. I know you can be better. I see who you really are beneath all this defense. I believe in you. And the narcissist allowed the empath to believe, not because they were moved by this faith, but because it kept the empath engaged, kept the supply flowing, kept the empath available for whatever the narcissist needed. This is a profound violation, though it's not always recognized as such immediately, because the violation isn't just of trust or boundaries, it's of something more fundamental. It's the desecration of what was offered as sacred. The empath brought their spiritual gifts, their soul's capacity for transformative love, and watched those gifts be consumed as mere resources in someone else's pathological need for validation. And when this realization finally arrives, when the empath sees that what they treated as a soul contract was treated by the narcissist as a transaction, that what they offered as sacred was received as supply, it creates a particular kind of devastation. It's not just heartbreak, it's a spiritual violation. It's the recognition that you brought your most precious gifts, offered them with reverence and care, and watched them be used for purposes entirely different from what you intended. The empath offered transformation. The narcissist took validation. The empath offered growth. The narcissist took stability. The empath offered spiritual partnership. The narcissist took emotional regulation. At every level, what was meant as sacred exchange was actually extraction, disguised as reciprocity. This realization often arrives in stages. First, the empath sees that their partner isn't changing despite their support and understanding. Then they recognize that their partner perhaps can change, that the pathology is too entrenched. And finally, most devastatingly, they realize that their partner was never trying to change, that the entire framework they believed they were operating within, mutual growth, spiritual evolution, transformative love, was never shared. The narcissist was never confused about what was happening. They weren't failing to understand the depth of what was being offered. They understood perfectly well. They just assigned it a different meaning. They saw the empath's spiritual gifts and thought useful, not sacred. They witnessed the empath's capacity for unconditional love and thought exploitable, not precious. And this is where the breaking of the soul contract becomes not just an ending, but an initiation. Because the empath must now face that their framework for understanding love, for engaging in relationship, for offering their gifts, it wasn't mutual. They were engaged in something sacred, while the other person was engaged in something profane. And they must now find a way to integrate this knowledge without losing access to their capacity for sacred connection, without shutting down the very gifts that made them capable of depth in the first place. The empath learns the hard way. Treating something as sacred doesn't make it sacred. Both people have to be in the temple for it to be holy ground. But the recognition that what they offered as sacred was treated as transactional is only the beginning of the empath's crisis. Because beneath that recognition lies something even more foundational, something that, when shattered, leaves the empath in a state that's closer to spiritual emergency than simple heartbreak. It's the collapse of their core belief in love's transformative power. You see, most empaths don't just believe in love as a nice sentiment or a pleasant feeling. They hold love as a fundamental ontological principle, a force in the universe that has actual power to heal, to transform, to redeem. This isn't romantic fantasy. This is often a belief forged in the empath's own experience of having been healed by love, or having witnessed love's capacity to reach people others had given up on, or having a spiritual framework that positions love as the ultimate creative and restorative force. The empath enters the relationship with the narcissist carrying this conviction. If I love this person deeply enough, authentically enough, consistently enough, if I see past their defenses to their essential wholeness, if I hold space for their healing, if I remain present even when it's difficult, this love will catalyze air transformation. Not immediately, perhaps, not easily, but eventually, the sheer force of being genuinely loved will break through their defenses, will remind them of their own capacity for connection, will awaken something in them that's been dormant or wounded. This is the empath's operating theory, and they test it thoroughly. They love the narcissist through their worst behavior. They maintain compassion when the narcissist is cruel. They see the wounded child beneath the adult defenses. They offer understanding when others would offer judgment. They stay present when easier relationships would have been available to them. They believe, with something approaching religious conviction, that love, real love, unconditional love, transformative love, will eventually break through. And then it doesn't. The narcissist doesn't transform. They don't soften. They don't heal. They don't become capable of reciprocity. The love that the empath believed would be transformative gets consumed without producing transformation. The understanding that should have created safety gets exploited. The patience that should have allowed for growth gets taken for granted. The unconditional positive regard that should have reminded the narcissist of their worth gets weaponized. And the empath is left with a crisis that goes far beyond, this relationship didn't work out. They're facing the collapse of a foundational belief about how reality operates. If love, deep, authentic, unconditional love, offered consistently over time, cannot transform someone, then what does that say about love? What does that say about the empath's understanding of their purpose, their gifts, their role in the world? This is a spiritual crisis in the truest sense, because the empath's identity, their sense of meaning, their understanding of their place in the world has often been organized around this capacity. To love transformatively. They've understood themselves as healers, as witnesses to others' potential, as holders of space for transformation. When that capacity fails, when someone is loved deeply and remains unchanged, when unconditional acceptance doesn't create the safety for vulnerability, when patient presence doesn't catalyze growth, the empath must question everything. They think, maybe I didn't love them enough. Maybe I wasn't patient enough. Maybe I should have stayed longer, tried harder, offered more. This is the empath attempting to preserve their core belief by making themselves responsible for the failure. Because if the problem is that they didn't love well enough, then the principle still holds. Love is transformative, they just didn't apply it correctly. But eventually, if the empath does the deeper work, They arrive at a more painful but more accurate understanding. They loved as deeply and authentically as it's possible to love. They offered everything their soul was capable of offering. And it wasn't enough, because love alone cannot transform someone who hasn't chosen transformation for themselves. This is the shattering. Not the recognition that this particular person didn't change, but the recognition that love, no matter how profound, how authentic, how unconditional, cannot heal someone who is defended against healing, cannot transform someone who prefers their pathology to the vulnerability required for change, cannot reach someone who has organized their entire identity around not being reached. The empath must now reconstruct their understanding of love itself. They must integrate a more mature, more complex, more nuanced understanding. Love is powerful, love is real, love matters, but love is not omnipotent. Love cannot override someone else's free will, cannot penetrate defenses the other person is committed to maintaining, cannot force transformation on someone who has chosen protection over growth. This reconstruction is painful because it requires the empath to release a kind of spiritual grandiosity they didn't even know they were carrying. The belief that their love could save anyone, that their capacity for unconditional acceptance could break through any defense, that their willingness to see someone's potential could call that potential forth. This is a form of magical thinking, however well-intentioned. The truth is harder but more honest. Love creates conditions for transformation, but it cannot guarantee transformation. Love can offer, but it cannot compel. Love can hold space, but it cannot force someone to occupy that space. The empath's love was real and powerful and valuable, and it wasn't enough, not because love failed, but because the other person wasn't available for what love was offering. This realization often leads to a period of profound disillusionment. If love isn't the transformative force the empath believed it to be, then what is? If unconditional acceptance doesn't create safety for vulnerability, then what's the point? If patient presence doesn't catalyze growth, then why offer it? These are the questions the empath must sit with in the aftermath of the broken soul contract. And the answers that emerge, if the empath stays with the questions long enough, lead to a more mature spirituality. One that honors love's power without inflating it into omnipotence. One that recognizes the sacredness of offering deep acceptance without assuming that offering creates an obligation for the receiver to transform. One that maintains the capacity for transformative love while releasing the need for that love to produce specific outcomes in others. The empath learns that love's power isn't diminished by the recognition that it has limits. It's actually deepened by that recognition. Because now it can be offered more freely, with less attachment to results, with more respect for others' autonomy. When the person you loved most transformatively remains untransformed, you learn that love is a gift freely given, not a tool that guarantees specific outcomes. And now we arrive at perhaps the most personal dimension of this breaking, the one that strikes at the very core of the empath's identity. Because it's not just that the sacred was treated as transactional, and it's not just that love proved insufficient to create transformation. It's something even more intimate. The empath's own gifts, the very capacities they've carried since childhood, that have defined who they are, that have been both blessing and burden. These gifts became the instruments of their exploitation. Let me explain what I mean. Most empaths didn't choose their empathy. It's not something they developed as adults through intentional practice. It's something they've carried for as long as they can remember. This heightened sensitivity to others' emotional states, this capacity to perceive what's happening beneath the surface, this almost involuntary attunement to pain and need in those around them. Often, these gifts emerged in childhood as survival mechanisms. The empath learned early to read the emotional climate of their environment because their safety or well-being depended on it. They became exquisitely attuned to others' needs because meeting those needs was how they maintained connection, earned love, or avoided harm. What began as adaptation became identity. They are empaths, not just in what they do, but in who they fundamentally are. And throughout their lives, these gifts have been simultaneously burden and purpose. Burden because feeling everything, perceiving so much, being so attuned to others' pain can be exhausting, overwhelming, isolating. But also purpose because these e-gifts have allowed them to help, to heal, to offer something valuable to the world. They've comforted the suffering, understood the misunderstood, seen potential in people others had dismissed. These gifts are sacred to the empath, not in a grandiose way, but in the sense that they represent something essential about their soul, their purpose, their way of being in the world. However difficult these capacities have been to carry, they've also been meaningful. They've given the empath a sense that their sensitivity serves something larger than themselves. And then comes the relationship with the narcissist. And the narcissist, with their particular form of pathology, does something devastating. They identify the empath's sacred gifts and systematically weaponize them. The empath's capacity to perceive beneath the surface, the narcissist learns to perform vulnerability strategically, revealing just enough wound to activate the empath's compassion while hiding the manipulation beneath. The empath's gift for seeing becomes a trap. Their perception is used against them. The empath's ability to understand why people behave as they do, to hold space for complexity. The narcissist learns that no matter how badly they behave, the empath will find explanations, will contextualize the harm within the narcissist's history, will generate compassion that buffers consequences. The empath's understanding becomes the shield the narcissist hides behind. The empath's capacity for unconditional acceptance, for loving people through their worst moments. The narcissist learns this means there are no actual limits, that unconditional means they can do tremendous harm and still be accepted. The empath's love becomes permission for abuse. The empath's tendency to see potential, to believe in people's capacity for growth. The narcissist learns this keeps the empath invested in a future that will never arrive, forever focused on who the narcissist could become rather than who they actually are. The empath's hope becomes the chain that keeps them bound. Every gift the empath possesses gets identified, studied, and exploited. And the narcissist does this with a kind of precision that suggests they understand these gifts perhaps better than the empath themselves does. They know exactly which vulnerability to reveal to activate protective instincts. They know exactly how much intermittent kindness will keep hope alive. They know exactly which words will make the empath question their own reality. This creates a profound crisis for the empath when they finally recognize what's happened. Because it means the very qualities that make them who they are, their empathy, their perception, their capacity for unconditional love, their belief in potential. These aren't just neutral traits that happen to be present in a harmful relationship. These are the traits that made them vulnerable to this specific form of exploitation. The narcissist didn't harm them despite their gifts. They harmed them because of their gifts. The empath's greatest strengths became their greatest vulnerabilities. Their sacred capacities became tools used against them. And this recognition forces a devastating question. Can I trust my own gifts anymore? If my empathy led me into this harm, if my perception was manipulated, if my capacity for unconditional love was exploited, if my hope was used as a chain, then what do I do with these capacities now? Some empaths respond by attempting to shut down their gifts entirely. They try to become less sensitive, less perceptive, less loving. They build walls, develop cynicism, refuse to let themselves feel or perceive or hope the way they once did. This is understandable. It's an attempt to protect themselves by eliminating what made them vulnerable. But this solution creates its own crisis, because these gifts, however much they've been exploited, are still essential to who the empath is. Shutting them down feels like self-betrayal, like killing off the most authentic part of themselves to avoid being hurt again. It's survival, but it's survival at the cost of their soul. Others respond by directing their gifts more carefully, trying to develop discernment about who deserves access to their empathy, their perception, their love. This is healthier, but extraordinarily difficult, because it requires the empath to hold complexity they've never had to hold before, that these gifts are valuable, and that they can be weaponized, that they should be offered, and that not everyone deserves them, that they're sacred, and that they need protection. The empath must learn to be simultaneously open and boundaried, sensitive and discerning, loving and self-protective. They must find a way to preserve their gifts while learning to recognize when those gifts are being honored versus when they're being exploited. This is the work of integration, learning that the problem wasn't the gifts themselves, but the lack of discernment about where those gifts were being directed. What the empath must ultimately integrate is perhaps the hardest lesson. Your greatest gifts will always make you vulnerable to those who would exploit them. The only question is whether you protect yourself by shutting down the gifts or by developing the wisdom to know who deserves access to them. But there's another layer to this breaking that often takes the empath years to fully comprehend. And when they do, it completely inverts their understanding of why this relationship happened at all. Because many empaths enter into relationships with narcissists carrying a particular spiritual framework, a particular understanding of their role. They believe, often unconsciously, that they're the teacher and the narcissist is the student. Let me explain what I mean. The empath often understands themselves as someone who's here to demonstrate love, to model compassion, to show what healthy relating looks like, to teach through their presence what unconditional acceptance feels like. They look at the narcissist, wounded, defended, incapable of genuine intimacy, and they think, this is why I'm here. This is my purpose. I'm meant to show this person what real love is. This framework gives the relationship meaning beyond the personal. The empath isn't just in love. They're fulfilling a spiritual calling. They're not just enduring difficulty. They're engaged in sacred work. Every moment of patience, every act of forgiveness, every instance of choosing compassion over retaliation becomes evidence of their spiritual evolution, their growth, their capacity to love as they believe we're all meant to love. And there's something seductive about this framework. It transforms suffering into purpose. It makes the empath special. They're the one capable of this level of love, this depth of understanding, this degree of patience. It elevates the relationship from a dysfunctional dynamic to a spiritual assignment. I'm here to teach this person about love, and yes, it's difficult, but that's because the lesson is important. But here's the karmic reversal that often takes years to see. The empath wasn't the teacher. They were the student. And the narcissist, despite having no spiritual awareness or conscious intention to teach, was delivering a lesson the empath desperately needed to learn. The lesson wasn't about how to love more deeply, more unconditionally, more patiently. The empath already knew how to do that, perhaps too well. The lesson was about something the empath had never learned, something their entire relational history had prevented them from developing: boundaries, self-worth, the capacity to say, this is unacceptable and I'm leaving. You see, the empath's capacity for unconditional love was never the spiritual strength they believed it was. It was often a trauma response disguised as virtue. The ability to love someone regardless of how they treat you, to maintain compassion in the face of cruelty, to stay present through consistent harm. This isn't spiritual mastery. This is self-abandonment that's been rationalized as enlightenment. The narcissist, through their pathological behavior, was actually teaching the empath what they'd never learned, that some treatment is unacceptable, that love doesn't mean tolerating harm, that staying isn't always growth. Sometimes leaving is the real spiritual work, that unconditional love for others means nothing if it comes at the cost of abandoning yourself. This is the lesson the empath came to learn, even though they thought they came to teach. The narcissist's cruelty, their manipulation, their systematic devaluation, all of it was showing the empath where their boundaries should be, but weren't. The narcissist's consistent failure to reciprocate, to change, to meet the empath even partially, it was demonstrating that love alone cannot heal someone who hasn't chosen healing, and that staying with someone who's harming you isn't spiritual service, it's self-betrayal. The breaking of the soul contract, seen from this perspective, wasn't a failure. It was the completion of the actual lesson. The relationship didn't end too soon. It lasted exactly as long as it needed to for the empath to finally choose themselves. The narcissist's ultimate betrayal, the final harm that made staying impossible, wasn't a deviation from the soul contract. It was the fulfillment of it, because the contract was never about the empath teaching the narcissist how to love. It was about the narcissist teaching the empath, through their behavior, through their pathology, through the accumulated weight of harm, that the empath's pattern of self-abandonment masquerading as unconditional love had to end. This realization is often devastating, because it means the empath spent years misunderstanding their own journey. They thought they were there to save someone else, to demonstrate spiritual principles, to model evolved consciousness, but they were actually there to learn something far more fundamental, that you cannot grow spiritually while abandoning yourself.